So let's look at the best mods and upgrades for your Audi A4. There's a lot of different engines offered. There's been quite a few different generations of the Audi A4 over the years. So we're going to look at the best mods and the best upgrades for your car, just to help you to get the maximum driver enjoyment from your car. There's also a few mods that are best avoided. They are urban myths when it comes to adding power to your car. So we're going to highlight some of those, and we're going to give you a real honest look at mods for your A4 so you can decide which ones are best for your project and which ones you should avoid. So when it comes to improving the performance of your Audi A4, there's two real aspects that you need to look at: the handling of the car and also the performance, the power of the engine. So those two things go hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other. So looking at the handling, the obvious way to go to start off with addressing the handling problems and improving those characteristics is to look at suspension kit. Now Audi tend to throw the S-line suspension kit on the more sporty models, which lowers it a little bit, but it's much firmer, and a lot of people criticize the S-line suspension as being too firm, too hard. So a set of aftermarket coilovers is a really good compromise because it allows you to drop your A4 a little bit, but it also allows you to retain some of the flexibility in the suspension travel, and it's not quite as harsh. It actually improves the cornering. You've got to avoid dropping a car too low as well, because that will affect the handling geometry of the suspension setup on your A4. So dropping it will affect the camber and the toe setting, particularly under cornering loads. A lot depends on where you're coming from and what you're aiming at. So check out the articles on our site, because we go into a lot more depth on suspension mods and suspension upgrades. Think about the rubber bushings as well. The mounts that the suspension attach to the chassis through get rather worn over age, and there's a lot more play and vibration that happens through that, and that really messes up the handling. So if your handling's not quite where you want it to be, the first thing you should look at, really, rather than getting a suspension kit, is just improving the bushings that connect the suspension to the car. Even thinking about upgrading polyurethane bushings, which have less flex than the rubber, but you can get different grades of polyurethane bushes, and that will really help sharpen up the handling of your A4. You can't beat getting the suspension properly set up and aligned, looking at the camber and the toe. If those are spot on, the car will corner much better than it would with a standardary setup. So investigate mods that help you to improve the camber and the toe angles of the suspension, particularly at the front. That's where all the work is going on. We can't talk about improving the suspension of your A4 without talking about improving the braking. Most people will think about big brake conversion kit, and that will certainly help. If you've got bigger discs and bigger pads, that will improve the car's ability to stop. But think as well about just replacing the pads. So a budget upgrade to your brakes is a decent set of pads. We would avoid the sports and race spec pads because they require a much higher operating temperature and they're not as effective on the road. You tend to get more noise from them as well. But something like the Pagid pads that I've used on my Audis, and I've had great effect from the Pagid pads. There's quite a few other pads as well that we recommend, so check out the articles on the site, because we go into each of the generations of Audi A4 in detail, and I flag up all the findings, all the feedback that we've had. Let us know what you found works on your A4, and we can share that information with other people and help them to make an informed decision when it comes to upgrading the brakes. Within the Volkswagen Audi group, you've got a lot of sharing that goes on of components. So fitting a set of RS brakes to a standard A4, or maybe even just a set of Golf GTI brakes to a standard A4, you've got pretty much a straight swap in most cases. Just check the hub sizes are okay. But that means you can go to a breaker's yard, get yourself a decent set of larger brake discs, and you're just going to replace them with standard factory parts when they wear out, which makes the ongoing costs a lot cheaper than having to buy an expensive set of aftermarket brakes every time they run out or every time the mileage gets up. Those dynamic angles that happen as the car naturally moves through corners can be really upset with the wrong suspension choice. So we would recommend for most A4s you just drop about 20 to 30 millimeters. Any more than that seems a little bit excessive. And the size of wheel that you fit as well has a bearing on that. So if you've got larger alloy wheels, you should drop the car a little less than you would with smaller alloy wheels, just to keep everything aligned correctly. But I'd also avoid large rim sizes on the A4s. So I had an A4, it was the B7, it was the 220 horsepower version, it had the Le Mans alloys on it, it had the 18-inch alloy. Now I've seen people driving around with 19s and they look fantastic. You can't beat the look of nice big alloy wheels, but you're adding a lot of unsprung weight to each corner of the car. You're also restricting yourself to low profile tyres. Now in the dry they will work quite effectively, but over here in the UK our roads are shockingly bad. They're full of potholes. They're wet most of the time, although we've had a bit of a drought lately. But in the main, our roads tend to be quite wet. So large alloy wheels and low profile tyres are not best suited for everyday driving. If you were taking your car out onto the track, then look to low profile tyres, big wheels, and get the maximum out of the handling of the car. But for everyday use, bear in mind your needs and the practical requirements of the car and avoid those really big heavy alloy wheels, and it'll keep your running costs down. You won't be buying expensive tyres every 5 minutes. Once we've got the handling sorted, it's time to think about power upgrades for the car. Now there's so many different engines that have gone into these cars over the years. There's been some really high power engines and some very economical engines. Generally in an A4 I found anything less than about 140 horsepower has felt slow. It's probably good fuel economy and those engines are perfectly serviceable, but when you've driven a 140, 150, 200 horsepower plus version of the A4, anything else will feel very, very slow. And the higher powered turbo engines give you better returns for your investment in your power. So the first mod I would always recommend people think about, if it's the only mod they would ever do, and that's a remap. So the ECU in the Audi A4 controls so many aspects of the engine, the way it burns fuel, how it responds under load conditions, the timing, the fuel, the air delivery, all of that comes into a package and it's set out in a map that the computer will refer to. If you alter those characteristics, you can make substantially more power. So we see power gains of about 20 to 30% just through remapping using entirely stock component on the car, which is a significant power gain considering that your investment is only going to be about 300 to 400 to get that sort of power gain. So that's probably one of the biggest bangs that you can get for every penny that you spend on mods and upgrades for your A4. So the next stage really involves looking at getting more air into the engine. So you need to think about turbo upgrades. Now there's lots of options out there for the A4 and it depends a lot on which engine you've got, but generally fitting a larger turbo will help you to make more power. You may need to think about uprating the fueling as well. You need to improve the injectors and the fuel pump if you're making substantial power gain. But generally most Audi A4s have adequate fuel supply system for a 20 to 30, maybe even a 40% power hike. Over and above that you start to need to invest in some pretty heavy duty components to support all of that. So with turbos you've got hybrid turbos which take the standard case and they replace the internals, so you might have an intake that's got a slightly larger compressor wheel and that'll help you make more power. You can tweak the internals of the turbo to give you the power where you want it. Do you want a faster spool up at the bottom end? Do you want more top end power? It's really can be tailor-made to you and what you actually want from the car. It's funny when people look at turbo upgrades, they often look at the headline power figure and give no thought whatsoever to the overall torque curve. So you might be having a massive spike at the top end or a massive spike at the bottom end. Now both of those would make the car practically undrivable. You really want to increase the power band throughout the RPM range and maybe have the power coming on more slowly at the bottom end just to aid with traction off the line, particularly if you've not got a Quattro version. So the early selection of turbos from the K03, which had a safe maximum limit of about 190, you can exceed that and I've known them to be pushed to about 220 horsepower, but by doing that you really do reduce the lifespan of the turbo. The K03S, which was an evolution of the K03, that was safe to about 215 horsepower and spooled up nicely from fairly low RPMs. The maximum on that is around 250 horsepower where you start seeing the turbo life diminishing, and the bigger K04 was fitted to the high performance derivatives of the engines and the safe maximum for those was typically about 220 horsepower, that sort of ballpark, but I have known those to be pushed to about 350, so there's quite a bit of headroom in those K04 turbos. On the later models we see the Honeywell turbos and a series of turbos, the IHI, IS12, IS20 and the IS38, and we'll be covering those turbos in more detail because there's quite a bit you can do to swap the turbos over to the higher powered units or just replace them with a hybrid. So there really is a whole world of options there. We've seen people almost doubling the power power of some models. So on our site we've got lots of engine specific guides that go into the power limits on stock blocks. For example, the 1.8T petrol hitting 350 brake horsepower on the stock internals. That was the AGU block, which has forged components inside it, and it's got a slightly larger head. But all the details of that are on our site. We've got specific pages that go into great detail on every single generation of engine that Audi have produced. And that was the AGU block, which has forged components inside it, and it's got a slightly larger head. But all the details of that are on our site. We've got specific pages that go into great detail on every single generation of engine that Audi have produced. So common problems that you tend to have with the turbo engines is the recirculation valve is often sticky. If you've upped the power dramatically, then it makes sense to upgrade that circulation valve as well. And that's what Audi do when they produce higher powered versions. They generally fit a slightly larger capacity turbo, and the valves that they use within the turbo to control the airflow and the wastegate are also uprated accordingly so that they can maintain reliability of their cars. So whenever you have a turbo compressing air into an engine, you get a big build-up of heat, and the intercooler is basically a radiator that allows the compressed air that's become very hot to be exposed to the flow of air coming into the car from the ambient temperatures around, and that drops the temperature back down. Now that makes quite a significant difference to performance. We've run a few figures and looked at lots of stats, and generally if you look at the screen now, we'll just flash up the significant difference that different engine temperatures make. So if you can lower your temperature of the intake charge, it'll carry more oxygen, you'll be able to burn more fuel, and you'll make more power. Now don't think of an intercooler as a mod that adds power to your engine. It's just something there to keep the power levels as they were originally designed. And as the intercooler does its job, it actually starts to get warmer, and we call that heat soak, where the heat builds up inside the intercooler itself. So after a lot of spirited driving, the intercooler will get quite hot, and it will really degrade its ability to cool that intake charge. It's fair to say that most factory cars come with very limited intercoolers. The capacity within them is barely adequate for your everyday driving. There's normally a very good argument for fitting an uprated intercooler to the factory one. It's normally much larger in size, the aftermarket ones, and they're best mounted at the front, which sometimes requires a little bit of modification to the front bumper just to make it all fit. But they sit down there quite tidily in front of the radiator in most different models. So it's certainly something worth thinking about. And if you don't do lots of spirited driving and you're not heating the intercooler up, you don't really need an aftermarket intercooler. But if you've added a bigger turbo, there's a lot more compression going on. It certainly makes sense to uprate the intercooler, and there's quite a few aftermarket options around that work really well, certainly a lot better than the factory standard ones. And even within model ranges, you'll find that the performance models sometimes come with better intercoolers than the lower performance ones. So do induction kits add power? Well, technically I have to say they do. Looking at all the dyno results, most cars will make a little bit more power, but to be honest, you are not going to notice it. You're wasting your money if you expect a power gain on a stock engine with just an induction kit added. But if you've tuned your engine and you're making a lot more power than you would have done originally, then it makes sense to upgrade the induction kit. But choose carefully, look at the volume of your standard airbox, and just make sure you're not fitting a cone filter that's much smaller. If you've decreased the surface area of the filter, you've decreased the airflow. And sad to say, a lot of the cheap aftermarket air filters and induction kits that are sold actually flow pretty badly. They're just literally trying to take money off you for the concept of having a power increase, and are offering a power decrease. So other mods that can be done on the A4 engines that are significant is your camshaft. So getting a performance profile on your camshaft will address the intake and the exhaust valves and how they open, the durations they open for. And if you've got the mapping right, the fueling right, and the air delivery through the turbo correct, you can make substantial power gains just through fitting a camshaft. If you don't have a turbo version, a camshaft will generally add about 10 to 15% of power to your engine. So that makes the camshaft upgrade one of the most significant power gains that you can actually add to your A4 if it's naturally aspirated. But on the turbo models, you can get even more because everything starts working together as a whole. One thing you've got to watch out for with camshaft upgrades is they often make the tick over at low end very, very rough. So you often need to turn the idle up to stop it from stalling, and it can make the car hard to drive in traffic. So there's a whole range of profiles that you can go for, up to the sort of really aggressive motorsport profiles. But for most people watching this video, we would just recommend a fast road profile. Now on diesel engines you don't get as much of a gain through a camshaft just because they operate in a much lower RPM range than the petrol counterparts. But there are some exceptions out there, so check out the articles on our site because we go into a lot more detail when it comes to camshafts and upgrades, and we've got detailed guides to each of the Volkswagen Audi Group engines, and we'll be adding videos to this channel that go in depth to different aspects of tuning, so we'll help you to get the maximum benefit from your tuning project. So please subscribe, we'd love you to stay tuned, so if you haven't done so, just hit that subscribe and bell icon so you'll be notified of all the new content that we put up. And please drop us a like because it really helps us to get out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.